G'day again. Mama Duck here. Another podcast episode. Don't know whether I can really slip it into the old Finding Ireland Funny category, because it's just sort of a random podcast. I used to write articles or essays, I guess you'd say, and blog them. But podcast is, well, let's say it's just going with the oral tradition of my Celtic DNA and not characterise it as Denise too lazy to write anything down, shall we? So I was thinking about Nazis. Nazis used to be funny. Now, Nazis weren't very funny from the decade of about 1930 right through to about 1950, shall we say. And there's nothing terribly amusing about the Third Reich. Don't get me wrong. The Holocaust, which at least 20 million human beings were exterminated by the German war machine during the Second World War, is real, a historical fact, and absolutely undeniable. There's no question about that. But humour has always been a way of belittling and attacking and reducing the harmful impact of evil regimes, particularly when you're combating propaganda. Propaganda can be good or it can be bad. The Third Reich, where Joseph Goebbels was head of the Nazi propaganda machine, was very effective, far too effective, one would say, in spreading their message of hate and permanent begrudgment, shifting the blame of economic failures away from those who deserved it and onto the shoulders of the other, where it be people of Jewish faith, Romanis, Polish, intellectuals, the LGBTQ community. Catholics were on the list after Jewish people in Hitler's world. Like, first they came for, it would have ended up with the entire world blind and toothless, as the saying goes. The horrors of the Nazi regime under Hitler cannot be overstated. But, of course, Charlie Chaplin started satirising Nazis very early on. Like The Little Dictator, Charlie Chaplin made his little tramp character when the little moustache under the nose, the little abbreviation, was quite a popular look. But it was only like Hitler who has left it, unfortunately, as a legacy of Hitler tash. Like, you just can't wear one of those now without people immediately thinking that you are an admirer of Hitler, not Chaplin. So that's propaganda for you in a nutshell. Hitler took over an entire moustache style literally demonised it. And then it's morphed into this humorous meme where now if you go on the internet and type in cats who look like Hitler, there they all are. Poor innocent pussycats with black markings under the nose that made them look like, that makes them resemble genocidal maniacs, or one of the most famous genocidal maniacs that ever walked the earth. But you see, that's humour. That's Nazis are funny. But you see, Nazis aren't funny. There's nothing funny about being a Nazi. There's nothing funny about anyone giving up on themselves and their community so much that they go and join a cult that's all about hating and despising other people. That's not funny. But I do refer you to all the very fabulous, mostly English, occasionally Irish, but mostly English, comedy, particularly sketch comedy and satire that evolved during the Second World War and then continued. So people like Spike Milligan and Peter Sellers, of course, they were all Englishmen, or Spike Milligan is of Irish descent, but was born in England. Actually, he was born in India, I think. Scrap that. His father fought in the British forces. British being a propaganda term, like you wouldn't believe. But Spike Milligan, Peter Sellers, a host of those chaps all joined up to fight Hitler, of course. Spike Milligan even wrote a book about it, which became a film. My Part in Hitler's Downfall. Part 1, I think it was, wasn't it? Because humour, particularly the blackest of comedy, helps one survive awful trauma, helps us put into perspective the crimes of humanity that the fearful and ignorant can commit en masse with the slightest of encouragement, given the opportunity to exercise their greed and their selfishness. So, for example, if you go to YouTube and type in the Monty Python Nazi sketch about local council, well, it's screamingly funny, and obviously it was made in the early 1970s when the war, as in the Second World War, had been won 30 years earlier by the Allies against Germany. Germany had been deindustrialised, demoralised. They still have military bases by the Allies in Germany to this day in order to be a strategic base and to keep an eye on them. Although they are now, ironically, the most progressive and welcoming of EU countries, but with a alarming subculture of right-wingers prepared to swing back into motion at the merest opportunity. The sketch by Monty Python about the Nazis standing for local council is hilarious because it was surreal, utterly surreal. It's hilarious to think of, post-World War II, there were all kinds of evil Nazis who, if they didn't take cyanide tablets like Joseph and Magda Goebbels, and then they forcefully poisoned their 6 children to escape justice from the Allies and whatever rough justice the Russians might have meted out to them. The Nazis who didn't commit suicide tried to escape if they weren't captured. And so there were always jokes about where they might be. And so the Monty Python sketch about the local Germans masquerading as locals in order to stand for council, but being quite obviously high-ranking Nazi military officers giving impassioned election speeches from a little hotel balcony at a seaside town is side-splittingly funny for the era. And, you know, and it goes over, of course, into Fawlty Towers, which, you know, are highlighted. People think that Basil Fawlty is a racist. Of course he is a racist, the character of Basil Fawlty in Fawlty Towers. Basil Fawlty was and is and forever will be a racist in so much that he is a fictional character with notions. But that's the very point. John Cleese isn't Basil Fawlty. John Cleese, who co-wrote the series Fawlty Towers with his then-wife, Connie Booth, who played Polly, and she never receives the recognition she deserves for that. They wrote that part of John Cleese and things were like as sending up the English establishment, the ones who are constantly trying to keep up appearances and cling on to like the wild cultural myth of, you know, best of British and English superiority. And you see that came about because they did win against Germany. And to listen to any of them speak, you'd think they did it by themselves. Just the same way right-wing Americans will say that, you know, the Americans won the Second World War. They didn't. Allies. A whole global alliance of countries banded together, pooled their resources in order to overcome the evil that was Hitler's regime. And not only Hitler's regime, there was, you know, Hitler had formed his own alliance, hadn't he? I mean, it was literally a world war. There were all sorts of things going on. Emperor Tojo had very much the same ambitions as Mr. Hitler did. And the Japanese aren't any better at teaching the true history of their conduct during the Second World War any more than certain other nations are. Which is why you have to depend on humour or contemporary writings or historical perspective, and history is, as it always has been stated, is written by the victors. You have to look at it in context, and the only way we can cope with the absolute horror of what man will do to man, if allowed, is to reveal them as utterly ridiculous. Hitler was utterly ridiculous, the same way as Trump is utterly ridiculous. The whole time that Hitler was in power, there were people parodying him left, right and centre. I mean, he was ludicrous. He was a little man. He was an ugly man. To watch him orate, he was like insane. But it was a poor and suffering, resentful populace that had nothing else to cling to except this one weird little man who could put on a huge show. And it wasn't even him, of course, because Hitler never came up with the worst of the excesses of the Third Reich. Hitler did not actually, technically, come up with the final solution. I'm not saying that the final solution wasn't a thing. Of course the final solution was a thing. It's absolutely a thing. But what happened was, and I encourage you all to go and do your research, a man in Germany with a disabled child wrote to Hitler and said he wanted to be able to euthanize his disabled child, and anyone lumbered with a disabled child should be able to euthanize them because they're a drain, blah blah. He couldn't bear the burden. In a normal, compassionate society, that letter would have been followed up not with a reply saying what a good idea, but with a visit from state authorities making sure that the child who was disabled was being cared for humanely. And if your father wants you put down, then it's a pretty sure bet that you are not being cared for humanely. But instead, that was taken as like the germ of a really good idea. It didn't go directly to Hitler. It went to one of his underlings. His underlings just seized this random letter and thought, that's a good idea. We can get rid of loads of people that we think are useless eaters by euthanasia if we think about it. So they started off with just trucks, diesel trucks, idling in neighbourhood streets with the hosepipe from the exhaust put into the back, with just a few people here and there, the unwanted, people with disabilities, people who have been rumoured to be queer or LGBT or anything, just here and there. And then it was people of different ethnicities. And then it wasn't very efficient. And it was too close to home and people were asking questions. So they moved a long, long way away and started trucking them there by rail. That's how it started. The way Trump started with all Mexicans are rapists and drug dealers, literally snatching refugee babies away from their mothers' breasts while being suckled at legal entry points of the international border at Mexico, where it is legal for people to seek asylum. Starts off like that. And before you know it, you've got a cult of armed insurrectionists storming government buildings, trying to hang the vice president. The fearful and ignorant, they thought they were storming the Bastille. They weren't storming the Bastille. The Bastille was down in Mar-a-Lago. They were storming the halls of democracy that people fought a French Revolution, an American Revolution, an Irish Revolution. People have overturned monarchies and oligarchies in order to establish democracy. And these goddamn morons, swayed by a con man with a gold toilet on January the 6th, actually thought that they were peasants rebelling against the elite, when it was the crooked and the elite who'd sent them out there just to create carnage and photo ops and to please one man. And Trump isn't a genius. Trump's not actually very good at anything. And people talk about Trump being the Teflon Don, how he got away with everything. He must be clever. He got away with everything. He's not clever. He's not clever at all. He was brainwashed very early by a father who was a card-carrying Ku Klux Klan member. Fred Trump was arrested in 1922 at a Klan rally in New York There's only one Fred Trump. He's a racist. The Trump's racism as a family is legendary. Donald Trump was brought up to be a racist. It's not offensive to say so. He was culturally brought up to be a racist. And being 75 years old, or just about, it's far too late to hope that he could ever see the error of his ways. He doesn't have great ideas. He doesn't have a great plan. What he ever had was all he ever had was money. And when you have money and you behave really badly, illegally, selfishly, criminally, violently, people might make fun of you, but they'll just let you keep doing it because they just hope that the money will fall out of the crazy tree onto them. With it comes power. Even those who are desperately loyal to Trump don't like him. They don't love him. They don't respect him. They all laugh at him. But none of them have got the guts to just say, money doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is other human beings on this short span. And so they let Nazis grow and grow and grow until Nazis stopped being funny anymore. I mean, all the Nazi references that were part of popular culture and comedy in the modern era. Think of the soup Nazi in Seinfeld. Think of all the times anyone has ever leant over someone's shoulder while they're typing and said, oh, you've got a colon there instead of a semicolon, and someone said, oh, fuck off, you grammar Nazi. Think about Back to Fawlty Towers again. As I was saying, Basil Fawlty and his don't mention the war. The point is that Basil Fawlty was offending those poor German hotel clients of his. The point is that, like, they're actually, like, you know, the German hotel guests are hugely upset by their encounter with Basil Fawlty. People who are laughing at it, they're not laughing because they're, oh my God, Basil Fawlty's sticking it to the Germans. It's cringe humour. We're laughing because Basil Fawlty is doing the absolute worst thing you can do, and he is like imitating like a genocidal maniac, goose stepping in an awfully comic way, to the horror of like the next generation of Germans. You know, it was like, from the pain comes the humour. But Basil Fawlty was 1970s, so it acknowledges the pain and the humour of the situation, but it is 30 years after the end of the Second World War that Fawlty Towers is made. So but Fawlty Towers was made in the 70s, Nazis were a thing of the past. When John Cleese and Michael Palin and the Monty Pythons were in a sketch about Nazis hiding out in Brighton, England, and standing for local council, it was surreal because in the 1930s, the Nazis were very close to ruling every human being on the planet. But by the 1970s, they were all gone except for a few perverts hiding in Argentina. Or people who fled to New York and were hiding out, you know. And then come 1980 in the Blues Brothers, there's that iconic scene, as most people's favourite scene in the Blues Brothers, where there's like a subplot of right-wing Nazi, right-wing Nazis, right-wingers and Nazis, white supremacists, getting in the way of the Blues Brothers, who of course are doing a musical tour throughout African American culture of the blues and popular music. So it's literally illustrating the black and the white sides of American culture, the legacy of African Americans, ever-growing legacy of African Americans towards American life. But the blot on the landscape that is the evil of white men who think that only white men should be able to run anything. And so when the Blues Brothers pull up and are blocked by a protest of Nazis exercising their freedom of speech under the First Amendment in the American Constitution, it was funny. The Blues Brothers say, Illinois Nazis, and then floor that and head straight for the bridge, and all the Nazis have to jump off the bridge into the river, unhurt, with ducks, blah blah. It's just a sight gag, it's physical humour. It's like, yay, Nazis bad, yeah, Nazis now wet. Funny. But then cut to the Trump era, and it's actually the exact coin side, flip of the coin side of that situation, and that there are real Nazis with tiki torches and polo shirts walking through a university town chanting racist sayings and slogans, actually shouting out slogans from the Nazi regime of the Second World War. And one of them actually got into his car and drove through a crowd of peaceful protesters that were staging, you know, a counter-protest against Nazis, and he killed a person and hurt a lot of others. So just think about that. Think of the contrast between Nazis being defeated, so we all thought, in the Second World War. Enough so that the references to them in popular culture saw them as the butt of everyone's joke, the defeated hopes of an evil culture based on myth and propaganda, wet and impotent in the river after the Blues Brothers drive through the crowd in a movie stunt. Contrast that with the real life consequences of someone influenced by Nazis and white supremacists who live in America, homegrown domestic terrorists with Nazi ideology, driving into a crowd of peaceful protesters in the 21st century and killing and maiming people. See, Nazis were funny in hindsight, like in Indiana Jones, when Indy first sees Nazis at a rally. What's his line? Nazis. I hate those guys. So everyone should. The lessons from history were very, very clear. They still remain very, very clear. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. So how were Nazis and white supremacy allowed to claw its way back, front and centre? Because we let it. Because no one wanted to be upset by anything. It started with the deniers. And then it started with people who sit at dinner parties, and there'll be like 10 people at a dinner party and one wrong 'un with a conspiracy theory he's found off an internet. And he's sitting at the end of the table and he starts talking bullshit. But no one wants to say, you're talking bullshit. Because that might make people feel uncomfortable and you won't enjoy the dinner party. You've got to get on with your neighbours. So people change the topic and talk about the weather, or just let it, or listen politely. And while he goes on, a couple of people are thinking, oh, you've raised an interesting point there. And then they go home and they get on the internet. They look up the same people. And it spreads like a virus, like a cult. Evil is done when good men stand by and say nothing. And for too long, good men stood by and said nothing. Just in the past couple of decades. And there's all kinds of reasons for that. And most of it has to do with when you're working 11 hours a day outside the house and you don't even have time to look after your own kids because you have to put them in daycare, because you have to pay the bills, and you have to do this and you have to do that. Who has time to notice that your next door neighbour is a Nazi? Until suddenly, one day, you go to vote and he's in the queue next to you and you realise that half of your friends are someone he would like dead because he just fell down a rabbit hole of Trump and white supremacy. It really is a constant battle between good and evil. Just like the superhero comics, I guess. Because evil never goes away, does it? The goodies always say that in the films, don't they? That evil never goes away. It just hides itself for a bit. A bit like Sauron in the Lord of the Rings, I suppose. That's pretty much how it is. White supremacy is about as evil as an ideology as the human race could ever come up with. But it's always been there. And people will use any excuse to justify it, whether it's religious myth, or they'll twist scientific facts, or just appeal to the lowest common denominator. But it's all a battle for the minds and hearts, isn't it? Back to the propaganda. And there's good propaganda, and there's bad propaganda. And it's somewhat ironic that Rupert Murdoch, who would tell everyone, if asked, that he stands for Christianity. Rupert Murdoch claims that Christians are the most persecuted religion on earth, just to illustrate his insane perspective. Rupert Murdoch claims to be a Christian, and yet he would step over the body of one of his fellow human beings to get to a pound note. You can't be a Christian and ignore the whole scripture about it being easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. Whether you're Rupert Murdoch or any of the Guns and Bible Republicans or Conservatives across the globe that think that their waspiness justifies them oppressing everyone else on the planet. So no, Nazis aren't funny anymore. We can make fun of them, but we can't ignore them. Not anymore, because the Holocaust is real. And so are Nazis. So there you go. That's me, sitting in my conservatory, thinking about the Nazi jokes that we can't use anymore because they're still fucking Nazis. And half of them believe that Trump is going to be put back in the White House by the end of August. Interesting times indeed. But all I can say is, as I sit here in my conservatory in the Republic of Ireland, in the peaceful trading bloc of the EU, that I'm grateful for the life I've been given. And I shall continue to think. I don't know what else I can do. I'm even more grateful that there's no Nazis living next door to me. So I'm grateful I'm not living in America, where I don't have to ever consider whether my neighbours might be a Nazi, own an AR-15, or have some very peculiar ideas on women's obstetric rights. I live in a republic, in a peaceful European Union, and as all good Republicans would say, I believe in equality, and I don't know how anyone can define themselves as a Republican and a white supremacist if a republic is all about equal opportunity. White supremacy is the opposite of that. So there you go. Nazis and Mama Duck. All you need is love. And I don't have any love for Nazis. I'll see you when you got nothing on.